Hey, thanks for tuning into my podcast. This is Big Head on the Block, hosted by me, Tim Henderson, aka Big Head. Welcome to Big Head on the Block. Today's topic, Mass Casualty Events. I have an in-studio guest with me today, Jim Steele. Welcome, Jim.
Glad to be here, Tim.
Just for a reference, Jim and I work together in the Crime Strategies Unit, which is a multi-agency group that's primarily focused on gangs, violent offenders, and ultimately the arrest and prosecution of the offenders. So Jim and I had the pleasure of working with each other, and Jim's a consummate professional. Jim, if you would give us a little bio of your time with Baton Rouge City Police and the other agencies that you've worked with since.
Well, I retired from the Baton Rouge Police Department in 2005 as a sergeant. Shortly thereafter, I went to work for the District Attorney's Office in East Baton Rouge, where I'm currently assigned to the Crime Strategies Unit. In addition to that, I also teach part-time for LSU's National Center for Bioterrorism and Training. We teach active shooter courses to both civilians and law enforcement.
Good deal. So basically, Jim's here today because he is a subject matter expert. Jim, for our listeners today, especially the ones that are civilians, in generic terms, can you give us the definition of a mass casualty event?
Well, it's more than 3 people killed or injured in a single event.
So this could be at malls, at schools, at places of commerce, just anywhere that is 3 or more, doesn't matter.
Right. You know, the common misperception is that this is usually happens at schools, but in reality, it more often, and in fact, about half of these events occur in what you would consider places of commerce.
And I know recently in Baton Rouge, we had a mass shooting in a nightclub. I don't remember the name of the nightclub, but I think 12 people were injured in that, correct?
Yeah, that's correct. That definitely qualifies for an event.
So these mass casualty events, it seems very commonplace now. When you turn the local or national news on, you hear about mass casualty shootings, and you hear about them, and it's almost as though maybe they're not trending daily, but at least multiple times a week. Would you not agree?
Absolutely. In fact, according to the statistics kept by the FBI, there's been a significant uptick since 2017 in these types of events.
Is there anything that you can maybe point a finger at saying this is why it's occurring more? A lot of politicians want to talk about having the ability to obtain these guns, and I don't think that's, I think criminals have always had that opportunity. Do you think maybe social media, maybe some type of prestige or just mental illness is causing this uptick?
In the ones that are planned as an event, it typically is the shooter's desire or the person who's using whatever, it could be a vehicle, it could be an edged weapon, to beat the score of the last shooter. It's been evidenced in a number of these that the shooter or whoever, let's call him just the bad guy, has researched past events such as Columbine.
Well, bringing up Columbine, let's talk about the focus on the school component of it, the active shooter. I think schools nationally, and I know locally we have resource officers, and I think they're a very important component. And I personally don't think that having semi-automatics is enough firepower. I have seen national news where one particular school, and I don't remember what state it was in, they had AR-15s and they had them slung and they were interacting with the kids. A lot of people think that this is militaristic. A lot of people think that it'll traumatize the kids. But I say to those people, the kids would be less traumatized if the officer had enough firepower on his person to where he didn't have to run back to his vehicle and get additional firepower. So what's your opinion on the AR-15 or whatever a resource officer should carry?
Well, the one thing that I'll say about that is these events are over in a very short period of time, typically less than 5 minutes. So that would not be enough time for the officer to go back and acquire additional firepower. That said, if that's the culture of the school and the institution and the community, that's fine. If not, then you'll just have to deal with the situation that you're in. In fact, there are a number of jurisdictions, New York City being one of them, that actually uses unarmed security officers. Now, most of these are well aware that they're going to be the first casualty, but it is better than nothing.
So basically, they put unarmed civilians that may or may not have training, I'm not sure of the program, or making them basically the scapegoat. They're going to defend kids. They'll be shot probably immediately if they try to engage, and now the kids are actively having to figure out how to survive on their own.
And the way we train them is not to engage. The way we train them is to try to manage the event and wait for the armed guys that are coming. And they will be coming with rifles.
Okay, so when you refer to the place in New York City, is this one of the places that maybe you have taught the run, hide, fight curriculum?
Right. We have taught to several thousand, actually, school safety agents. We have taught them the run, hide, fight curriculum from the Department of Homeland Security, as well as the active threats on campus, which simply adds a medical component to the run, hide, fight.
I know here in Baton Rouge, and you retired from Baton Rouge City Police, and so did I. I've been retired about 2 years, but I know that we had a response protocol that was put into place many years ago, but we've done extensive training on active shooters, and it's the responsibility of the people who arrive first to engage the shooter and to eliminate the shooter, even moving beyond casualties in order to stop the threat and eliminate the ability of them to continue to kill. Is that something that y'all teach in your curriculum, or is it something that you think maybe nationally they ought to have a curriculum in place for this kind of training?
Well, currently, I think most police departments have a protocol where armed officers will move towards the threat immediately. They will step over bodies. They will pass casualties, and they're taught and trained to do that, because if the mind hasn't gone there, the body will not.
So you're saying that officers took the job knowing that it was an inherently dangerous job, and they should understand the risk involved. If there's an active shooter, you engage. If they have more firepower than you, then you do the best you can with the training that you've had. Is it true, Jim, in your training and your background, that they're less likely to continue to fight if they know an officer is approaching them? A lot of times they'll end it by shooting themselves. Is that true?
Absolutely. You can go back to the killings at Virginia Tech University. It appears from all the evidence that we can gather that the shooter took his own life when the SWAT team breached the back door with a shotgun.
So basically, they're willing to engage people that can't fight back, but when the people that have the firepower show up, that's whenever you see how much of a coward they are.
Absolutely. Typically, they're not going to fight it out with a trained individual, because generally speaking, the people who would do these kind of things are not that well trained. They're not typically combat veterans. They're not typically ex-cops or deputy sheriffs. They're just people who have, for whatever reason, decided they want to be a footnote in history.
Do you know, in your training, if there's a particular age group, especially referring to school shootings, that is more likely to commit this type of incident?
Well, unfortunately, based on years and years of research by the U.S. Secret Service, there really doesn't fit into a type. However, that said, Currently, what they're working on is looking at behavioral cues that somebody might spot. Typically, in every one of these instances, there's some kind of what is referred to as leakage, in that somebody knew or somebody saw something and failed to report that to the proper authorities, or if it was reported, it was not taken seriously.
So if you see something, say something. We talk about that a lot, and we talked about it a lot at Baton Rouge City Police. If you see something, say something. You're not a rat. You're not a snitch. There's nothing wrong with saying, hey, my friend is making these type of accusations or Facebook posts. Maybe it's something that we need to look at. Is that kind of what you're referring to?
Exactly. And currently, I'm not aware of anything in Baton Rouge, but there are places around the country that are doing these behavioral threat assessment teams where they will make contact with an individual who appears to be at risk and try to figure out some kind of way to deter him, because they're almost all hims, from the violent behavior, connecting him with whatever services he may need.
Well, if anybody's out there listening to this podcast and they're interested in starting up a team of that capacity, count me in. And I'm sure Jim wouldn't mind being a participant also, because we spend between us, we've probably got 70 years experience in law enforcement, and we try to protect those and defend those who can't defend themselves. So it bothers us when kids are shot, because we know how innocent they are, and we know that they don't have the ability to fight back.
And let me just say a word about law enforcement and reacting to these incidents. I think it should be a clue that when you have to put on body armor, when you have to put a pistol on your side, when you have to get into a patrol car, has a radio, you have tasers, all these other less lethal weapons, that should be a clue that you're in an inherently dangerous business. And it's up to you to make sure that your training and your experience is up to speed so that you're ready for this.
Yeah, I've heard people say, I don't know what I would do in this situation, in that situation, not relative to school shooting, but any situation. And especially if they're veteran officers, I'm baffled that they would even say something like that, because, hey, man, you've been doing this job for 5 years, 10 years, 15 years. If you don't know what you will do by now, then perhaps you've chosen the wrong career. And I say to every officer out there, engage. Stop these people from killing more people. If you're scared, work through it. If you're a warrior, do what warriors do. Eliminate the threat. I want to shift focus just a little bit and ask you this question, Jim. How come courtroom security is structured to stop anybody from coming in? You never hear about courtrooms being attacked. A lot of federal buildings, if you go in, there's one way in, metal detectors and everything. Can we not incorporate something like this in our school system and say, hey, we're going to make you go through metal detectors, and if they have exterior doors, which they have a lot of them in schools, maybe they could put something on the doors to indicate that they're open, and have somebody, monitoring it or have an alarm sound. Like in a restaurant, you can't walk out of a back door, or the restaurant will buzz and they'll know that you're trying to leave. So little small things like this, do you think that we can incorporate something like that to ensure that our children aren't victimized?
Well, what you're essentially talking about is target hardening, whether it be metal detectors, locks, whatever. And unfortunately, what you have is a hodgepodge of schools that have been built since, maybe even the 1930s and 40s. And you have to retrofit those schools. To me, if I was in charge of school safety or security, I would be doing an assessment on every school within my jurisdiction to see what is needed. Now, the next thing they're going to tell you is there's a cost involved. Well, yeah, there is a cost involved. So how many dollar value are you going to place on the life of a child? Right.
Yeah, they got costs involved in everything, but the traumatic experiences that people have to go through after these incidents are very costly also. I'm with you. Pay the money, do the assessment. Let's get our kids safe. While we're on the topic of school shootings, I want to bring up Uvalde. And I took a hard look at that particular event. And my wife and I watched about an hour and 20 minutes or so of YouTube video. The one thing that really bothered me when I watched the response is that there were people there pretty quickly. They went down the hall, they disengaged, and even though I knew the outcome for an hour and 20 minutes or so, I always felt like they're fixing to go. They had shields, they had SWAT members or tactical guys, that were dressed different, so I'm guessing they're tactical guys. And I kept telling my wife, surely they're going to go. And I'd be goddamn if it took them well over an hour, man. It was, as a cop and as a human being, man, it just tore me up inside. And, please try not to get emotionally attached to events, but that's one that actually kind of bothered me. And maybe you can give me some insight on why the level of personnel was there, but they refused to engage.
Well, clearly what we had there was a failure in leadership. They decided early on to treat this as a barricaded subject rather than an active shooter situation, despite the fact that they knew there were injured people, injured children, injured teachers inside those classrooms. And I think that ultimately the leadership it just failed. And groupthink set in amongst the officers, and rather than somebody take the initiative and just go through the door, they all developed that same mindset that, well, we're going to treat this as a barricaded subject because the chief or the lieutenant or whoever was in charge, decided that's the way they were going to do it. My personal opinion is that's wrong. And whoever is in a leadership position, whether it's a field sergeant, lieutenant, chief of police, whatever jurisdiction, that individual needs to develop the mindset that we are moving to the threat.
Right. So as we look into it a little further, do you think because multiple agencies responded that there could have been a lack of communication, a lack of an incident commander, or anything that comes to mind that would lead to this issue?
In many of the instances that I've looked at where multiple agencies respond, that often is an issue. It's the who's in charge. It's the how we're going to manage our radio systems. It then cascades down into the fact that nobody takes the initiative. And it gets even worse when you're talking about the fire rescue EMS response as well, because until the armed people can stop the shooting, the people who come in with medical, whether it's fire rescue or EMS, they cannot stop the dying.
What about lack of exposure to major incidents in Baton Rouge and the surrounding parishes? We respond to a lot of shootings and a lot of domestic events, disturbances and stuff. Is it possible that they just lacked exposure to these critical, serious incidents?
It is quite possible, and I have a friend that is a police officer in a jurisdiction not far from there, and basically what he told me is law enforcement in that area is pretty much handled by the Customs and Border Patrol. The municipal police officers and deputy sheriffs, there's so few of them. Now, the difference in Uvalde is that they had a dedicated police force to do nothing but police their school system.
Oh, wow. I wasn't aware of that. That makes it even harder to comprehend. Well, I'll say this. I worked for the Baton Rouge City Police. I've worked for the East Baton Rouge Sheriff Department. I've been in around the Livingston Parish Sheriff Department and a lot of other agencies in this area. And I can assure you that if this type event did happen here, there would be somebody, even if it was the lowest ranking officer on scene, that would engage So I tell administrators, make sure your people are trained and make sure that they're prepared. What is the old saying? Train hard, fight easy.
Exactly. You don't need to train somebody on how to write a crash report after they've been doing it for a couple of years, because that happens every day. It's the things that don't happen every day, like these mass casualty events that you have to train for. And you can't skimp on that training. Not only do you have to train well, and you have to have a program that has efficacy.
Yeah, we train with simunitions, and if you specifically referring to Baton Rouge, we trained with simunitions every time we did this. So if you made a mistake, you would get shot, and it didn't feel good. Obviously, it doesn't feel like a bullet, but it hurts more than people think it does, more than a paintball gun. But the realistic training, the first time we did it was in a hospital, and it was pretty hard to overcome the situation. But I've always been under the impression that you lay down as much fire as you can, and even if you're overwhelmed by their firepower, you got a lot of bullets. Most officers have at least 3 magazines, so you got 70 rounds or so. Spend them all.
Well, and that's one of the problems with a lot of police training, is it's all set up for failure. There's not a clear way to resolve the conflict, whatever it may be. Don't know why it works that way, but there should always be, in any training scenario, a proper way to resolve whatever problem you're working.
Well, I remember the first time we did it, the circumstances definitely favored the offender, the bad guy, the shooter. We suffered a lot of officer casualties, if you will, during the training session. And the thing that confused me the most is the number of officers that initially were shooting victims that were running and, putting their arms up. They intended on trying to make this person look like an aggressor, but they weren't. They were unarmed. So I think having that exposure and then later having different scenarios kind of led to the path that you say, the path of success, and not just necessarily an event failure.
Well, and another thing we need to do in our training is we need to train our officers that you can be injured and not die. And that's why I'm such a firm believer in integrating combat medical training into any active shooter training. Because if you're shot in one of your lower limbs, you may only have 2 minutes to live.
Right.
And you need to get a tourniquet on there, and you need to get a tourniquet on there fast. And
I'll say this, during the last 7 or 8 years, Baton Rouge, I think, is leading the nation in that type of training. Baton Rouge City Police is one of the most effective, has one of the most effective training curriculums, I believe, anywhere in the country. We do chest wounds, we do tourniquets, we do everything that you say, because if one of our officers or a civilian is shot, we try to, especially the officer, we try to keep them in the battle. When we were young, Jim, we used to play cowboys and Indians, and everybody said, bang, bang, and the next response is, you're dead. Cops have a different mentality. We understand that bang, bang may mean that you're shot, but if you still have breath in you, you still have the ability to fight back. We've had many officers that have been shot that have continued to return fire. I know several personally that had to switch hands or had to shoot from the ground, and they continue to fight. So staying in the game, bang, bang, you're dead, that's out the equation. Bang, bang, you're shot, okay, let's move on. Yeah, it doesn't feel good, but hey, you're a warrior. Like I said earlier, you took the job, it's your responsibility. Because if you can't eliminate the threat, then they're going to cause more damage. And, sometimes it may cost an officer their life, and in our area, it has cost officers their lives. Many heroes have died in a combat situation.
Well, and I know you and I both have dealt with cops that have been shot on the job. It's not pleasant, but they survived in most instances. One of the things that I'll tell you what my mindset is is that somebody may take my life, but I'm not going to give it to them.
Okay, listeners, let's hear that one more time, Jim.
My mindset is that somebody may take my life, but I am not going to give it to them.
Yep, that's a good phrase. Let's go ahead and pivot a little bit, Jim, here. And let's talk about your run, hide, fight curriculum. And let's talk about situational awareness. I'm intrigued at the number of people who don't pay attention to their surroundings. I see people looking at their phone when they get out of their vehicle, when they walk out of a restaurant. The run, hide, fight curriculum, can you give people some insight from a civilian perspective on what they can do to protect themselves?
Well, if you start with situational awareness, the first thing that I do when I go into some place that I don't know, and even places that I do know, because things do change, is I figure out where all the entrances and exits are. Typically, I'm not going to use that, but that may be where I'll push my family towards, because much like yourself, I'm going to the fight. I'm not going away from it.
Right. I'm armed everywhere I go. FYI, people, if you see me, Tim Henderson, big head, whatever block I'm on, I have a pistol with me. So I urge citizens to be armed. Even if you do open carry, I'm okay. Second Amendment people, a lot of cops don't like open carry, but I say the good guys got the guns on the hip. The bad guys are the ones that you don't see.
Well, and so let's get back to situational awareness. So your average civilian needs to know where they're at. And that's exactly the way I put it. Where are you at this very moment? If you had to leave quickly, how would you leave? If you had to hide behind something, what would you hide behind? If you had to use something as a weapon, what would it be? It could be anything. If you're in Home Depot, for instance, it could be those small paint cans. I guarantee you, you start hurling quart paint cans at some guy, he's going to find another aisle to be on. So my basic working theory is, as a civilian, run if you can, hide if you can't, and fight if you must. But as a cop, you're going to run to the threat. The hide part has to do with cover and concealment. And obviously, we know what the fight part is.
Right. You know, some people aren't built for combat, man. And if you're that person, it's okay. Do your running aspect of it. But I'm not built to run, Jim, so I have a hard time with that. But I know there's a lot of people out there that are civilians that may choose that avenue.
And know what actually you can hide behind or hide in. When I was a kid, we went through the Cuban Missile Crisis where they thought they were going to lob nuclear weapons at us, and they told us to hide under our desks, like that was going to do something. And unfortunately, in several of these active shooter situations, people have done that. They've hidden under desks, hidden under tables. That's not cover. That's not really even concealment.
Yeah, that was one thing us older people were taught. Hide under the desk when there's a tornado. Hide under the desk when a nuclear attack happens. Hide under the desk, and the desk absolutely offered no cover. So if you're in a area, say in Walmart, hiding behind a box of cereal is not going to help. Those bullets will penetrate all that. So know where you're at, and if you are able to run and get concealment, like Jim said, be somewhere that's going to be sturdy and not behind a box of cereal.
Well, and understand the difference. Concealment is something that hides you from the bad guy. It's not going to stop a bullet. It's better than nothing, but cover is something that would stop a bullet. Cover would be a cinder block wall. You can hide in a bathroom. There was a young man that an active shooter came into a Waffle House one early morning, and he immediately went into the bathroom. A few minutes later, he noticed that the guy was either had a rifle malfunction or he was reloading, and he left his place of cover and went and grabbed the rifle and wrestled it away from the shooter and survived. When he was interviewed later, he was called a hero, and he said, "I'm no hero. I just didn't want to die."
Yeah, hey, man, that's a profound statement. A lot of people do things that are heroic in certain instances like that we label as heroic, but the fight for survival sometimes overtakes whatever fear that you may be experiencing at the time. Most cops, I don't know any personally that wouldn't engage, and I'm sure there's a lot that wouldn't, but I urge those cops to, like I said earlier, reevaluate where you're at in life and know that people are depending upon you in these situations. Jim, whenever young girls, young guys, they're usually have these AirPods in, they're looking at their phone, they're walking through a parking lot, say at a clothing store, at a big strip mall, they're not paying attention to anything. How easily victimized are they? Can you kind of just give us some insight on that?
Well, that kind of identifies you as a potential victim right there. If you're staring down at your phone, sitting in a car in a convenience store parking lot, you're inviting somebody to walk up to you, put a gun in your face and say, "Excuse me, sir or ma'am, I'd like to have your car," and or words to that effect.
Right.
But if the guy was intent on robbing the store, wouldn't it be better to take away a 2022 Camaro, for instance? So you identify yourself right away as a victim. A lot of people, when they're running or jogging, they're not situationally aware. Now, there's safety in numbers. I don't mind people listening to their music while they're running or jogging, but think about that safety in numbers aspect. Know where you are. Know what's happening around you at all times. Heighten that situational awareness. And that alone will separate you from the victims.
And if you're out there jogging, the easiest avenue for somebody to get you is from behind, especially if they're in a vehicle and you're in close proximity to the street. But remember, you're running, and you can probably outrun the person who's attempting to victimize you. So keep running. While we're on the topic, let's talk about the fight aspect of it, Jim. Tell us what civilians can do and what's involved in fighting.
Well, and one of the things you have to realize is there are no rules in fighting when you're fighting for your life. Use whatever you can. Your elbows, your car keys, doesn't matter. And when you're talking about in a classroom situation, a school situation, if you're going to fight, if you're barricaded and fortified in there, be ready in case your location is breached. But if you're going to fight, fight as a team. If I'm going to get down there and grapple with the bad guy, I expect everybody else in that room that's an adult to be there with me.
Right. Yeah, that you make a good point there, because if you're not able to subdue them yourself, usually a mass quantity of people, usually 3, 4, 5 people can overtake them. So that's a good point. So like Jim said, make sure that if you see a situation like that occurring, that you don't just run, that you try and help somebody, especially if they've engaged the offender or bad guy.
Exactly. We need more people that are willing to step in and resolve the situation. Ideally, if you could resolve the situation using your verbal skills, that's great, but that doesn't always happen. And if somebody's already on the ground, get in there and do something.
In today's climate, we hear a lot of car backfires. We hear balloons pop, and we hear all this stuff. So our mindset these days shouldn't even be that it was a car backfire. What do you think? What should it be?
If you hear something, think, unless it's July 4th or, January 1st or thereabouts, think gunshots first. Worst case scenario, you've just had a drill.
And best case scenario, you're prepared for whatever's coming, and you've recognized, analyzed, and realized, hey, man, they're shooting. You can identify where it's coming from, identify what you intend on doing about it. As you say, run, hide, or fight. But people need more situational awareness. They need to understand in today's climate, it doesn't matter where you're at. If you're at Burger King, if you're at McDonald's, if you're at the mall, many shootings happen. Shootings happens everywhere, churches, everywhere. So put it in your mind. Mental preparation, is there anything people can do, Jim, mentally to prepare themselves, not to be hyper vigilant all the time, but just to be prepared in case it does happen so they're not overwhelmed by the moment?
Well, that's exactly right, Tim. We don't want people to be paranoid. We want them to be prepared. And what you have just alluded to is what we call normalcy bias. People don't want to believe it's gunshots. They want to believe it's something other than that. And there's a natural human reaction to any kind of disaster. The first step is denial. After that, it's deliberation, and that's where that fear sets in. You got to progress through denial and deliberation and get to that decisive moment where you do something, run, hide, fight, whatever it may be. So you've got to progress through those stages quickly.
Good deal. Well, today we talked about a topic that I hope was interesting for y'all. Before we leave, I want to tell a quick story about my time with Jim in the Crime Strategies Unit, along with our military assets, Sonia Armstrong, Harley Grand staff. Jeff Malone, a.k.a. True Money, and Kiva Sims was also part of our team. At one point in time, I was getting transferred from the division, and I came up with a phrase when I would come into the office, dead man walking every morning. And I think Jim and the rest of them used to get a kick out of it. I was able to get a stay of execution for a couple of months, but eventually when I made lieutenant, I was transferred back to uniform patrol. Jim was exposed to a lot of music through Lucy and Kevin Gates, Out the Mud, and some other rock that he wasn't really accustomed to hearing. So we had a good time at CSU. We did a lot of operations. We had a lot of success, and we had a lot of fun. So thanks for being here today, Jim, and your friendship and knowledge is always welcomed.
Tim, thanks for having me, and brother, I'm here for you anytime.
Good deal. Thanks for tuning in to this episode of Big Head on the Block. I'm Tim Henderson, the host. I look forward to dropping another podcast soon. Please give us any comments, likes, dislikes, or any topics y'all would like to discuss. Thank you.